Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee because today we are going to be discussing the book of 1 Samuel. Well, hello and good morning, friends and faithful listeners, and happy Monday, and thank you for starting out your week the right way by reading some Bible with me. I did not actually realize until today that we are on the last chapter of 1 Samuel. I didn't realize it. And so then I was looking forward and I'm just like, oh, well, Wednesday we are going to be starting the book of 2 Samuel. And if you've listened to this episode all the way through, that means that you have listened to, let me count, 14 books of the Bible. That is fantastic. That includes the Old and the New Testament books. So you can pat yourselves on the back for that. That's a big achievement, a big accomplishment. A lot of people don't read one book of the Bible, and you guys have read through 14 books. So that's very exciting. Now, before we begin today's episode, I do have a new blog post out, and it's a commentary on David's lies and how someone who is considered a man after God's own heart could lie so much. It was written by my lovely mother. And the reason that she wrote about David's lies is because we are now going to be streamlining the blog posts more so that they fall in line with the podcast episodes. So everything you read on the blog pretty much from here on out is going to line up with something that we are talking about on the podcast. So keep that in mind and make sure to check out the new blog post about David's lies. It is linked in the description of this episode. And make sure to subscribe also to the emails so you don't miss upcoming blog posts. All right, let's read 1 Samuel 31, the entire thing. It is not a very long chapter, but it is dense with content. So there's going to be a lot to talk about. I'll be reading out of the WEB this morning. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathon, Abinadab, and Melchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle went hard against Saul, and the archers overtook him, and he was greatly distressed by the reason of the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was terrified. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he likewise fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all of his men that same day together. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley, and those who were beyond the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. On the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and sent into the land of the Philistines all around to carry the news to the house of their idols and to the people. They put his armor in the house of the Ashtoreth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Beth-shan. When the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose, went all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Beth-shan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and fasted for 7 days. So we've known for a few chapters now that Saul is going to die. And now here it is at the very end of 1 Samuel. The last chapter of 1 Samuel describes Saul's death and basically the end of the reign of Saul. So it says that the Philistines went and fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell down slain on Mount Gilboa. This means that the battle was really, really hard for the Israelites because they actually started out on Mount Gilboa. That was where their camp was. So if the Israelites are fighting in the camp, that shows that something very seriously bad is happening, because typically people don't want to fight near the camp, right? They want to fight away from the camp. And yet Mount Gilboa is where the Israelites are dying, right in their own camp. So it says the Philistines killed a ton of Israelites, and they also overtook Saul and his sons. And the Philistines killed Jonathon, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. So Saul actually had 4 sons, the other son being Ishbosheth, who is not mentioned here, most likely because Ishbosheth did not actually fight in this battle. Most people think it's because Ishbosheth was too young to really fight any battles. He was born much later in Saul's life. But Jonathon, Abinadab, and Malchishua were the sons that always went out to battle with Saul. And we don't know a lot about Abinadab and Malchishua, but we do know a lot about Jonathon. And unfortunately, Jonathon died also in this battle. And so you might wonder, well, Jen, why did Jonathon die if Saul was the one being judged by God? Well, it's a good question because it does say in Scripture that God does not punish the children for what the parents have done. However, there are always consequences for people's sins. And we know that Saul, throughout his lifetime, sinned a lot. And he never really turned away from those sins, never confessed those sins, never repented from those sins. Instead, he just kept doing them, even though he knew that he was doing wrong. Saul did a lot of damage in his lifetime, and it's very possible that this entire battle actually could have been avoided had Saul turned back to God, right, and asked God for forgiveness. It's very possible that God would have granted Saul victory, as he had done in the past many times before, against all of Saul's enemies. So that's the first reason, is that there was consequences to what Saul had done. And unfortunately, this very deadly, bloody battle was one of the consequences of Saul's sin. And lastly, one of the reasons why I think Jonathon died was because Jonathon was not supposed to be the next king. David was. And so if Saul died, Jonathon obviously was next in line for the throne, according to human traditions. And there would have been potentially a lot of problems between Jonathon and David had that happened. Because, like I mentioned, Ishbosheth, the 4th son of Saul, he actually becomes the king for a tiny little bit after all of this happens. And there's all sorts of problems between Ishbosheth and David. And so perhaps one of the reasons why Jonathon died was because he just was not supposed to be the next king. And there would have been a lot of trouble had he become the next king. But in the end, it was all in God's will. God was giving the throne to David. It was not supposed to go to Saul's descendants. Saul is being overtaken by the Philistines in this battle, and it says that he was wounded very badly by the archers. The WEB says he was greatly distressed by reason of the archers, but what that actually means is that he was pretty wounded by the archers, and it's very possible that he would have died from the archers if he had not said to his armor bearer to kill him. So an armor bearer obviously was somebody that went alongside somebody and carried the shield and carried the sword and carried basically everything that the person would need in battle. That was the point of an armor bearer. So he says to his armor bearer, look, kill me now, because I do not want the Philistines coming and torturing me and abusing me and also killing me. I do not want to die from the Philistines, so you kill me right now. But the armor bearer wouldn't do it. The armor bearer was terrified, actually, is what it says. So he refused to draw his sword. So Saul takes his own sword and falls on it and kills himself. And so his armor bearer sees that Saul was dead, and he fell on his sword as well and died with Saul. Now, why did the armor bearer also kill himself along with Saul? Possibly because he felt that there was no other way, that he was going to die anyway, because this Philistine battle was so terrible, right? So it's possible that the armor bearer just lost hope and killed himself once he saw that Saul, the king, was dead. Or it could also be that he was afraid he was going to die anyway, because he didn't do his job as the armor bearer. Those are the two reasons why I can think why the armor bearer also killed himself. But it says right here in verse 6, a very solemn verse, Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all his men that same day together. So everybody that was there with Saul on Mount Gilboa, it says, died. So this was a very, very gruesome and bad battle for the Israelites. It was so bad, actually, that it says that the people who lived beyond the Jordan, the Israelites who were living on the other side of the Jordan River, they actually abandoned their cities and fled because they were so terrified of the Philistines. And so now the Philistines are just like happily moving into these cities that the Israelites abandoned. It says the Philistines came and lived in them. So this entire battle was a huge momentary success for the Philistines. They thought that they won a great battle. I think that they believed that they were going to come in and occupy Israel because already they're moving into the cities and they killed King Saul as well as all of Saul's sons that they knew of. They probably thought like, who's going to take the throne now? We're going to go into Israel and we're going to take everything. That is probably what they thought. So they're happily living in these abandoned cities. And it says on the next day, the Philistines go to where the scene of the battle was to go and pick through what all of the Israelites had, is what it says. It says they came to strip the slain of their armor and their weapons and everything. And they also found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. So instead of stripping Saul, well, they do that also, but not only do they strip Saul, but they also cut off his head, is what it says. And they stripped off his armor, and they sent news into the land of the Philistines, to the house of their idols, and to the people, meaning that they were celebrating the death of Saul and giving thanks to their own gods for the death of Saul. So they were praising their gods because they killed Saul, Jonathon, Abinadab, Malchishua, and all of the other warriors of Israel. They were praising their gods for all of this. So this entire battle gave the Philistines a reason to blaspheme Yahweh. So they cut off Saul's head, and it says that they take Saul's armor to the house of the Ashtoreth, meaning the house of one of their gods. Ashtoreth was a very famous supposed goddess back in these days. And so they take Saul's armor into the house of Ashtoreth, is what it says, as a celebration to give thanks to their God. And on top of that, they fastened Saul's body. And it also says later on, the bodies of Jonathon, Abinadab, and Malchishua as well, to the walls of Beth-shan. Now, what is Beth-shan? Beth-shan was a city that most likely was built by Canaanite people, and then eventually the Philistines came in and overtook it for a while, and it's possible that the Canaanites actually got it back. There's not a lot of history on Beth-shan, but apparently people now, to this day, are really trying to excavate Beth-shan to see what went on in that particular city. But Beth-shan was just a city, a famous city back in these days, and they take Saul's body and then the bodies of Saul's sons as well and pin them to the walls of Beth-shan. Now, this would have been a huge, huge insult, because don't forget that Saul would have been completely naked, as well as his sons, pinned to that wall, and birds probably would have come down and landed on the bodies and honestly tried to eat the bodies. This was considered one of the cruelest things that you could do. Actually, something even worse than death, apparently, was to have your body, after you die, left out in the open or shamed in this way. In fact, there is an Old Testament law that God gives in Deuteronomy chapter 21, specifically about bodies hanging. just because this was such a common thing to do if you really wanted to disgrace the person that you killed. So if you read Deuteronomy 21, verse 23, here's what it says. You must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it the same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So God himself said, if you choose to disgrace somebody, you can only do it for this many hours. You have to bury the body before evening. And now, why would God say that? Because first and foremost, this was a very common thing to do if you wanted to disgrace somebody. And secondly, because God made it a law that you actually have to take the body down and bury it, it actually discourages the person from putting the body up on a pole to begin with. Because imagine how hard it is to get the body up there, and then just a few hours later, you have to go take it down and bury the body. So God put that law in place to completely discourage desecrating human bodies like that, because it just wouldn't be worth it to do something like that, if that makes sense. But the Philistines, who didn't have the Old Testament law and didn't care about just leaving bodies out to rot, thought that this would be the ultimate punishment for Saul and his 3 sons. However, here's what it says in verse 11. When the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose, went out all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Beth-shan. They came to Jabesh and burned them there. So even though it said earlier in this chapter that so many Israelites had fled from their hometowns for fear of the Israelites, there were still valiant people left. And some of the valiant people were in Jabesh Gilead. Now you might remember that name actually from several chapters back, because Jabesh Gilead was the first city that Saul had ever saved after he was anointed to be king. And that was a great victory. And Jabesh Gilead was almost completely overtaken, I think, by the Amalekites, was it? I don't remember. But they were almost completely overtaken. And Saul and Samuel, with the helping hand of God, came and rescued Jabesh Gilead from complete and utter destruction, basically. And so Jabesh Gilead now is returning the favor to Saul and his sons, because they actually have to go to battle to get Saul's bodies off of the wall of Beth-shan, because they had to cross over into enemy territory to do this. And yet they did it, and they courageously succeeded. They got the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons back. And so when they get back to Jabesh Gilead, it says that they burned the 3 bodies there. Now we know that Jonathon was a faithful man, and that he was going to be in heaven, right? Because he was a faithful man and he believed in Yahweh as his God. And yet his body was burned here. And some people really question, like, well, is cremation a sin? Is cremation something that we should never do? And here's an excellent example of a man who was burned, after death, who was basically cremated and yet still went to heaven. And, burning a body, cremating a body, God has all of our DNA memorized. I heard somebody say that recently. I think it was actually my pastor said that. God has our DNA memorized. Like, he is all powerful and he knows all of us inside and out. So if somebody in your family was cremated, you don't have to fear Jesus not being able to, rise them from the dead in the end when Jesus returns again and he says that he's going to let the dead in Christ rise first. You don't have to fear if your family members have been cremated, because God can do anything. He can raise the dead from ashes. God absolutely can do anything and everything that he wants to do. So just giving that little comfort for anybody who was concerned about that. So the bodies were burned, and it says that they took their bones after the bodies were burned and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh. and then they fasted for 7 days. Because this was a very scary 7 days for all of Israel, if you think about it. Because yes, even though David was the anointed, not many people, I'm sure, remembered that. I think a lot of people kind of forgot about David. David's kind of living in Philistine territory right now. He's not around. He's not seen. And so Israel, they probably think that they are without a king, and they're probably terrified. What's going to happen to us next? Who is going to come and take us over? Are the Philistines going to continue to succeed in taking our towns and destroying us? So the Israelites are terrified. So after the death and burial of Saul, the Israelites fast and mourn for a full week. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed the last episode of 1 Samuel. And I hope you enjoyed 1 Samuel in general. This was a really, really fun book of the Bible for me to discuss and talk about. And I hope it was a fun book of the Bible for you to read and listen to. Faithful listeners, make sure to join in on Wednesday because we'll be in 2 Samuel. Once again, I'm not going to be changing the season numbers. Just moving straight into 2 Samuel because actually these books, 1 and 2 Samuel, are technically just one book, but over time got broken up into 2 books. Anyway, guys, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Don't forget that on Ko-fi, we are going to be uploading special content for those who are behind the paywall. So if you're interested in that, check out the membership tiers over on Ko-fi. You'll see that linked in the description of this episode. Faithful listeners, have a fantastic rest of your Monday. I will see you all either tomorrow for an episode out of Romans or on Wednesday to start the book of 2 Samuel. Happy listening and God bless.